So it's time to figure out how to connect our Go code to a database. And we're going to do that not in our bookings project just yet. Instead, I want to do it in a very small standalone program that just shows us how everything works. And once we figure that out, then we'll implement those changes or implement that kind of code in our bookings project. So in order to make that happen, I'm going to create a new database. And I'm going to use Postico just because I like it better than dbeaver, but you can use the same kind of logic in dbeaver. So I'm creating a new database, which I will call test_connect. And I'll open that database, and I'll add one table in there. And the table is going to be called users. And it will have an ID of type serial, which Postico helpfully gives me by itself. But I'll add a column called first name, first_name, all lowercase. It will be of type varchar. And I'll add another one called last name. And that will also be a varchar. And I will save those changes. So of course you're probably doing this using dbeaver, but I like this one better and I'm going to use it whenever I possibly can. So I've created this database and that's all I want to do in Postico or in dbeaver. Now I'm going to start up and I'm going to use Visual Studio Code because it's been a while since I've used it. And I will open this up and I will close this window and create a new project. So I'll create a new folder. Let me close this altogether and create a new window. And I have no open files or folders, so I have to open one of those. And I want to open a folder. And I'll create it in my Visual Studio Code documents, which are here somewhere. There they are. And I will create a new folder called Test Connect. Okay, so now I've created this file, or created this empty folder, and I have no files open at all. So let's create a new file, and I will do that by looking at my Explorer right here, going to Test Connect and creating a new file. And I will call that main.go. Then I'll open my terminal window, and I'm right here in my terminal, and I will create a Go mod file by saying go mod init github.com tsolar test_connect, just to create a Go mod file. Okay, so I have this document, I have my terminal window open, which I'm going to close, and let's create a simple Go file. So package main, and it has a main func main. And I'm going to do stuff in there. And let's think about the things we want to do. The very first thing I want to do is to connect to a database. And after I've connected to it, I want to test my connection. I'm going to put comments here and we'll write the code one step at a time. After I've connected to my database and after I've tested my connection, I want to see what's in that database. So get rows from table. We have a database, there's no rows in there, but we'll put some in a moment, okay? Then I want to insert a row. Then I want to display, or do the get rows from table again. So my goal here, first of all, is to connect to the database, which we haven't done yet, but we will. Then I want to test my connection to make sure it's actually active. I'm going to ping the database. Then I want to display all the rows from a table, which we'll add momentarily. So we'll get a couple of rows from the table. Then I want to insert a row, then get all the rows from the table again, which would show whatever rows we had here plus the one that we added. Okay? After we've done that, I want to update a row. And then I want to, once again, get the rows from the table again, which should show our changed row. Then, after that, I want to get one row by ID. Okay? And after that, I want to delete a row, and then I want to get the rows again. So what we're doing here is basic CRUD operations. Create, read, update, and delete. And once I can do all of those things in this simple program, then I should be able to do that in our bookings program, because the basic logic will all be right here. And you might want to save this file just as a reference to see how things are done. But we're going to be doing it frequently enough that you will become ever so used to it. So the first step is to connect to a database. Now, how am I going to do that? Well, in Go, there are a couple of packages that allow you to connect to Postgres. There's one called libpq, and it's fine. I've used it in the past. It works quite well. And there's another one called jackc/pgx. And interestingly enough, the author of libpq recently posted, in a response to a question in one of the Go forums, which package should I use? And the author of libpq says, I would actually use jackc's package because, it works really well. And it is a good package. And the URL for it is right here. And I'll put a link to this in the course resources page, if I remember to. But if I don't, it's right there, github.com/jackc/pgx. So we need to install this. So I'm going to copy the GitHub part of the URL, everything but not including the HTTPS. And I'll go back to my terminal, open it up, and say go get. And I'm going to put /v4 at the end of it, which will get the latest version. I think it's v4 is the latest. Yeah, it is. Okay, so v4. And install it. It will go get it. Updates my Go mod file, and it's there. Now I need to connect to my database. So in order to do that, I need to actually give a certain instruction to this program. So very first thing I'm going to do is say con, which will be my database connection pool, which I'll talk about in a minute, possibly an error equals SQL.open. So it imports a database SQL for me. And I want to open of type PGX, which is right out of the documentation, and you can see that in his example file down here. PG Connect, he's actually using a different one. Let's go to the Getting Started guide. Okay, so how to connect world from Postgres, PG Connect, context background. I want to use the SQL Connect, which is, let's see, database SQL. This is the one I want. He has a database specific driver for Postgres. We're not going to use that. We're going to use the default SQL package that's part of Go, just to keep things as close to pure Go as we possibly can. So he gives us an example here of how to initiate a project and how to connect to it. And this is what we're doing right here, okay? So let's go back here, and our type is PGX, and then we need to have a connection string. And the connection string for Postgres is dead simple. Specify a host. Our host is equal to localhost because our database is right on this machine. If you were connecting to a remote machine, you'd have a different link there. But we're just using our localhost. Port is equal to 5432, which is the default port for Postgres. The database name, well, we named ours test_connect. The user, in my case, is TCS, which is my username. You'll specify your own username there. And the password, in my case, is empty. And in your case, it probably is too. But if you have a password, you would specify it there. So that will give us a connection pool and potentially an error. So we better check for an error. If error is not equal to nil, what am I going to do here? I will just say log fatal. I can't go any further, so I may as well die. And I will print a meaningful message there. Format.sprintf, and I'll put in the message unable to connect to, and then I'll put my error message in there, which I'll just say unable to connect, and I'll put my error message, which will be a placeholder V followed by a new line, and then I'm replacing that placeholder V with the actual error. Okay? So that gives us this. So let's just try that. Let's leave our connection empty, okay? And you think that might work, and it won't. And it won't work because when you go back to your Getting Started guide, you can't just import database SQL. You actually need to tell this package which driver you're using. In our case, we're using pgcon. So let's go down here and look at what he's doing, okay? He needs to import this standard library. So let's copy that line and paste it in here and see what happens. So I'll try running this. Go run main.go. And it worked. No errors. That's great. Okay. I actually want to do more than that, more than just connect. I actually want to use this connection pool. So let's look at that con that we have right now. When we connect to Postgres by opening a connection to PGX using this connection string, it returns a pool of database connections that we can use. And we can actually specify how many connections should be in that pool and all sorts of things. But right now, I just want to connect, okay? Once you've opened that database pool, you have to close it when you're done with it. And that is absolutely critical, because otherwise these connections to the database will always stay open. Even if this program closes, they might stay open. So we need to close it when we're done. And we know how to do that. We use the defer command. Defer con, and it has a function on it called close. So after this function, this main function, finishes executing, it will actually close that connection pool. All right, so now let's log something. Log.println connected to database. Perfect. What's the second thing I wanted to do? Well, I actually want to test my connection. And we can do that by pinging the database. And we can do that simply by saying, store in the variable error, which we've already initialized up here, so I don't have to use the assign operator. I can just use the equal. I can say for the connection pool, just ping the database. If error is not equal to nil, then I'll log fatal. And I'll say log.fatal cannot ping database. And that will kill the program, okay? I could put the error in there if I wanted to, but that's sufficient for our purposes. Otherwise, I'll say log.println pinged database. All right, let's run that and see what happens. So I'll clear the screen, and I will say go run main.go and see if we can ping the database we connected to. Connected to the database, ping database. So far, so good. So we're actually connected to the database, and we can talk to it by pinging it. We send it a ping, it sends back a pong response saying, yep, you can connect to me. So that's good. All right. Next, we want to get some rows from the table. Well, before I can do that, let's go put some rows in the table. So I'll look at my users table, and I'll look at the content. And you'll do this using dbeaver probably, but that's fine. I'll just insert John Smith, and I'll insert another row called Mary Jones. I think I left a space in there. I should probably get rid of that. Yeah, I did. Okay, and I'll save these. Now I have 2 rows in my database. So now I have something to query. Okay, so how do I get rows from the table? Well, you can see here, I'm actually getting rows here, and then I'm getting rows here, and then I'm getting rows here. Seems to me that might be a great place for a function of some sort. So let's create a function, and I'll call that function getAllRows. Okay, so we'll just create it first, func getAllRows, and it's going to have at least one parameter. It's going to have to take my connection pool, and I'll call that con here, just like I did above, and it's of type a pointer to SQLDB. That's what con actually is, okay? So when I call con up here, when I get this con, SQL open, I can point at it, and you can see that it returns a pointer to SQLDB. So I've got my con, I'm going to pass that as a parameter to this function getAllRows, and it's going to return something. What is it going to return? Well, I think an error is sufficient for our purposes right now. If there's an error, it will return that. Which means if everything goes properly, then I have to return nil. Okay, so I've got this function. I'm going to call it. I can do it right here. I can say get rows from table. All I have to do is say error equals getAllRows, and then check for the error. If error is not equal to nil, log.fatal, and I'll just log the error. Okay? I have to pass it the connection, con. So we're calling this function, but it's not currently doing anything. So let's make it do something. So what I'm going to do is relatively straightforward. I am going to say store in a variable called rows, which will be all the rows that come back from the database query, and potentially an error, because it'll throw one if we get an error. From our connection pool, I am going to write a query. So there's the syntax. And the query is just going to be select ID, first name, last name from users. So there. I'm going to call the database connection pool con, execute the function query, and pass it this query. And it's going to store the results in the variable rows. So I need to check for errors. If error is not equal to nil, log.fatal. No, I don't want to die there. I'll just say log.println. Error, and then I'll return the error. Okay? So I log it here, I return it. Otherwise, I have something useful in those rows. Now, just as you have to close database connections when you're done with them, so you must close rows. Whenever I'm querying something that will potentially return more than one row, I have to close that connection. And here, I know because I have 2 rows in the database, I'm going to get 2 rows. But no matter what I do, when I'm writing a query that can potentially return more than one row, I have to close those rows when I'm done with them, which I can just do by saying defer rows.close. So when this function getAllRows is done, it will close those rows. And again, if you don't do that, if you forget to do that, you might not notice that error for quite some time. Hours, possibly even days. But eventually, your database will run out of resources and it will just die. So you need to make sure that you close the rows when you're done with them. So I've got these rows of information. And the question that we have now is, how can I pull something out of that rows variable and store it into variables that I can do something with in Go? Well, you do that, first of all, by declaring the variables you want. So I know that I'm going to have 2 variables, first name and last name, both of which will be type string. And I know that I'm going to have an ID of type int. Okay? So I've declared those variables. Now I want to populate them with data from the rows variable. And I do that just by ranging over the rows. I can say for rows, and it has a function called next. So what it's going to do is range over all of the rows one at a time. And what I'm going to do as I range over them is scan the values from the rows into the variables I've declared here. And I do that as follows. Error is assigned, and because it's inside the rows, this is a different error variable than the one up here, so I have to use the assign. Error is equal to rows.scan. I am going to scan everything I've queried in the order that I've queried them. So ID, first name, and last name. And I want to scan the variable, the first entry in the first row into ID. So I give it a reference to ID. Then first name. And then last name. And that potentially throws an error. And if it throws an error, I need to do something with that. So if error is not equal to nil, then what do I want to do? Log.println error, and I'll just return the error. And that will get us out of this function and take us back to our main function, and we'll do whatever we need to do from there. So now I have these variables populated with data, ID, first name, and last name. So what am I going to do with them? Well, I've scanned something into them. I want to give some feedback when I run this program. So what I'll just say is format println, and I'll print those values. So I'll say record is, and then I'll print ID, first name, and last name. And it'll continue to the second row and do the same thing. Okay, now the last thing I need to do when I'm going through this rows after I do the for rows next is you always should check for an error again. If error, and in this case I'm going to say if error equals rows.error, or error is not equal to nil, just shorthand here, then do something. Log.fatal, and I will log fatal here, error scanning rows. And this is just good practice because you might get an error as you're scanning through this, and it might not be caught by this. It's always good practice when you're done scanning through all of your rows just to check for an error one more time. And then just to make things more readable, I'll say format.println, and I'll just put some dashes so I can see when I'm done with one query to get all rows and the next. All right, so this should run. Let's open our terminal, clear our screen, and say go run main.go. And it did. We connected to our database, then we pinged our database, then we got record 1 is John Smith and record 2 is Mary Jones. So that all worked just perfectly. What's the next thing we want to do? We want to insert a row. Well, inserting a row is, again, not that difficult. We're going to use our connection pool. So in this case, I'll define my query first, just as a string. I'll say my query string is assigned the value of And whenever I'm writing queries, I tend to use backticks because then I can put the query on multiple lines. This one will fit on one line, so I could use double quotes, but backticks are your friends. That way you can write your query in a readable format because some of our queries are going to get quite long. So you may as well get in the habit of doing it now. And all I'm going to do is write straight SQL, which we already know. Insert into users, and I'm going to insert just into first name and last name, and let the serial take care of the ID column, certain values. And the values I'm going to put in, I'll put in, well, I could type them in here, but it's not what we're going to do, because what I'm going to do instead is use placeholders, $1 and $2. That is my query. And what are those dollar signs? Well, I'll show you right now. Let's call, and I'm going to discard the first return from this function, but trap for the error. Let's call con.exec. And I'm going to exec a query. I'm going to execute a query. And the query I'm going to execute is query, that variable I defined right in the line above. And I'm going to substitute for $1 and $2 these values in this order, Jack and Brown. So when this query is called, it passes the query to the database. Here's a query that's going to be coming, and these are the placeholders for the values. And then it reads the values that are substituted. So $1 is substituted with Jack, $2 is substituted with Brown. And this is a much safer way of executing a query than trying to do it simply by building strings. Because what this forces the database to do is to not allow arbitrary SQL to be executed if you just build a string by hand. So if I instead, say I took some user input for first name and last name, and someone said, my first name is delete from users, semicolon. The potential exists that when the exec command is run, that it says, oh, look, you want to run this first part of the query, whatever it is, but then you want to delete everything from the user's database. And calling the query this way, using the substitutions, $1 for Jack, it prevents the database from inadvertently running malicious code that might have been inserted by a user. So it's best to use this format, and that's what we'll be using for the remainder of this course. So I've run that query, and it potentially throws an error. So let's say if error is not equal to nil, what are we going to do? I will just say log.fatal error and die. All right. And then if this succeeds, then we just want to call our getAllRows again. So I'll just copy this and paste it here. And let's see what happens. So let's open our terminal, clear the screen, and type go run main.go and see if we did everything right. And it looks like we did. So we connected to the database, we pinged the database, we listed all the records that are currently in there, then we did our insert, and then we listed all the records again, and now our new record is there. Perfect. And if I run that again, of course, I'll get a fourth row with Jack Brown. And let's just put one more thing in here just to make sure that it works as that it gives us more meaningful information. I'll say log.println inserted a row, just to give some more feedback on the screen. So let's run it again. I'll open the terminal, clear the screen, and this time I should get 4 rows, 2 with Jack Brown, but different IDs. And I do. So that works great. Next, what do we want to do? We want to update a row. Well, updating a row, as you might expect, is pretty much the same syntax as inserting a row. But instead of writing a query that inserts a row, we write a query that updates a row. So I'm going to use a new variable this time. I'll call it statement, STMT. That's going to be assigned the value of in backticks, because I don't know how long my query is going to be. I'll say update users set first name equal to Jackie in single quotes, where first name equals Jack. Now, is that a good syntax? No, it is not. I mean, I can do it here because I'm controlling the input, but I really should do this instead. $1 and $2. Okay? So there's our statement. Now we just call our exec function on our connection pool. So I'll ignore the results of that again, and I will just say trap for the error is equal to con.exec, and I'm going to pass it the statement this time, not my query, and then what I want to say is set first name equal to, in double quotes because it's a string, Jackie, and my second substitution will be Jack. So, and if it dies, print the error and stop the program. Okay? And now we'll say log.println updated one or more rows. And then I'll get the rows from the table again. So I'll copy this and paste it down here. Now ask yourself, what's actually going to happen when I run this program? Well, if we look at our terminal window, how many rows do we have with the first name set to Jack? We have 2. So when I run this, it should insert a third row with the name of Jack and then rename all of those rows to Jackie Brown. That's what I think is going to happen. Let's find out. So I'll clear the screen. Go run main.go. And it did exactly that. It inserted another row to give us 3, and then it renamed all of those rows to Jackie Brown. What if I just wanted to update one row? Well, I could do that very easily, and I can do it by simply saying, adding my modifying my where clause. I can say update users, set first name equal to Jackie, where ID equals $2. And in this case, the ID is not a string. Let's get an ID that we can use. I'll use record 5 because that's currently set to Jackie, and I know that it will be the next time I run this program. So I can say where ID is equal to 5. So let's save that, clear the screen, and run it. Go run main.go. And do make sure that you save it. I actually, under my Visual Studio Code, which I'm becoming somewhat more familiar with, I have autosave turned on, just so I don't ever have to think about it. But it's up to you. Anyway, let's run it and see if our update this time works on just one record. And it does. So it changed just this record 5, which was, I think it was record 5 I was doing. Yeah, 5. It changed 5 to Jackie Brown. So life is good so far. And you notice that these are not in any particular order because I've not specified an order clause. So 6 actually came before 5 because, presumably, this was the most recently updated one. But I never trust the order from a database. Anytime I want to get things in a particular order, I'll add an order clause. But that's beyond the scope of what we're trying to do right now. All right, what do we want to do next? Get one row by ID. Well, getting a row by ID uses a slightly different syntax. You recall down here, when I call get all rows, I'm using con query, and I'm actually deferring the rows close. When you're getting one row, you're either going to get one row or none, you know that. Things are a little bit different, but it's not that difficult. So let's rewrite our query. I already have the variable, so I don't have to assign it. And this time I'm going to say for the query, select ID, first name, last name from users, where ID equals, and I'll put my placeholder in there. And now, again, I'm going to call a method or a function on my connection pool, and I'm going to store it in one variable because this method only returns one row. So I'll call my variable row and use my assignment operator to create it and initialize it at the same time. It's equal to, from my connection pool, query row. And this will return, as you can see here, it executes a query that is expected to return at most one row. And I know that when I specify where ID equals an ID, and ID is my primary key, it can only ever return at most one row. So I call it and I pass it my query, and I pass it my substitution for $1. I know there's an ID 1, so I'll specify that. So now, where is the error? Where's the potential error in this case? Well, it's a little different when you use query row. It doesn't return row and error, it just returns one thing. And it's not until I try to read that row that I potentially get an error. So I now write my reading of that row as follows. I will say, well, I need somewhere to store these things, so let's declare some variables first. I'll say var first name, last name, string. Same as I do in the function down here, but because this is in the scope of only the main function, I have to redeclare those. And var ID is of type int. Okay, so now I have somewhere to store these. Now I can say error equals row.scan, and I scan my values in. Ampersand ID for the first one, ampersand first name for the second one, and ampersand last name for the third one. And then I check for my error. So I say, if error is not equal to nil, and I'll just log fatal error. All right, so let's see if this works. So I'll save it, open my terminal, clear the screen, go run main.go. And it seems to have worked just fine, except that I forgot to print this stuff out. So here I need to say log.println query row returns, and then I'll put ID, first name, and last name. And let's run that again. Clear the screen. And it runs. Query row returns 1 John Smith. Okay, so now we know how to get multiple rows, and we know how to get a single row. The last thing I want to do here is delete a row. And again, this is not that difficult. So let's delete one row. Again, we just have to have a query. I'll use my query variable that I've already initialized is equal to delete from users where ID equals $1. And I run my query as follows. I'm ignoring the result that it's passing me, but looking for the error. And that's equal to, there's nothing new on that side of it, so I use an equal sign, con.exec, and I pass it my query, and this time I'll delete ID 6. I know that exists for right now, so this will work just fine. If error is not equal to nil, log fatal error. And now I'll print out my results. I'll just print out log.println deleted a row. And then I will get all of my rows from the table again. So I'll copy this and paste it down here. So what should happen now is after I've executed this last row, ID 6 shouldn't be in the last listing. So let's save this, open the terminal, clear the screen, go run main.go. And ID 6 is conspicuous by its absence. So everything seems to work. So what we have now, and this is just the basic way of doing it, we're going to improve it by using context a little bit later on. But right now we can connect to a database, close our connection pool when we're done with it. We can ping it to make sure it's active. We can get all the rows from it. We can insert into it. We can update data in it. We can get one row by ID, and we can delete from it. So that's basically everything you're ever going to do with the database. Your queries might get more complex, and they will, but this is the basic methodology for working with a database. And that's all we need to worry about at this point. All right, so let's move on and start thinking about how we're going to connect our bookings application to a database in a way that makes sense. And one of the things we're going to work on, or keep in mind as we do this, is right now we're using Postgres as our database. What if down the road you decide to switch from Postgres to MySQL or MariaDB or MongoDB or one of the many, many databases that are available to you as a programmer? So we're going to make our database queries as portable as we possibly can.